We have today we have an informational briefing, and it is from Dr. Ben Johnson, and he's a retired cardiologist who specializes in electrophysiology, and it's a separate subspecialty dealing with heart rhythm disorders and implantable devices. That's been his focus of adverse health effects arising from exposure to industrial wind turbines for about 4 years. And he became extremely involved with that and understanding everything from turbine physics to human biophysics. And he's been studying that for quite some time. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Johnson. He grew up in Omaha, attended Iowa State, by the way, University of Iowa, and the Oregon Health Sciences University. And so, Dr. Johnson, are you online with us? Do we have him, Jade?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we have you now.
Okay.
So you can go ahead. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for being with us today.
Okay, let me get this thing started. So my topic today, I don't know, you can't see me, at least on my screen. Can you see me? Can you see me on?
We can't yet. No. What should we have him do, Jade? Oh, at the bottom of your screen. Now we can see you. Okay. And when you want to show the presentation, just hit share down at the bottom and we'll be able to see your presentation.
Okay. I can't quite see that. Sorry about that. Hold on. I guess I got to escape. And I don't see the share. Shoot.
Should be down toward the bottom.
Yeah. Let's see here. WebEx. Share. There it is. And then here. Is that good for you? Okay.
Yes, there it is right there. So you can go ahead and hit play, I think, on that, Dr. Johnson. And we're sorry, we got a late start. So we don't want to rush you, but we've got about, 40 minutes or so.
I'm having issues here. I'm sorry. I can't launch meeting. Open WebEx.
Oh, we've got you there. Just go ahead and play your presentation. We'll be able to see it.
I apologize. Just a minute here. I'm not seeing my slides. They were there, but now they aren't.
It might be the very top one. I can't see it very well, but.
Oh man, okay. Fuck. Let's see here.
Hit the arrow in the top left corner. Oh, it disappeared.
Is Carly there? Is she helping us?
You know what? We have the sheets in front of us, and people online can look. So you could just go ahead and go through the testimony, and we'll be able to follow along.
Well, I need to see my slides.
Okay.
So, I can back it. I'm getting an echo here in my room here. Let's see here. I apologize. I done everything I was supposed to. Let's see. Gosh dang it. Where's my slides?
I would say go back to your PowerPoint presentation.
Okay.
I would click on the PowerPoint presentation and find that, and then just go ahead and follow on through with that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you and see you.
For some reason, I'm getting a feedback in mine. So you're going to have me echoing, and hopefully it's not you. Okay, so this talk is on assessing adverse health effects related to industrial wind turbines. Can you hear me fine okay there?
Yes, we have you now. We're good.
Okay, assessing risk in the absence of proven health safety. So again, you mentioned some of my background, cardiologist retired, and this presentation is more focused on very recent scientific data within the last 4 years. It supports the individual's right to make informed decisions about their health. It reflects our duty to protect the health, safety, and welfare of our community. In the beginning, and this has been a turbulent road, I thought and assumed that wind turbines were quiet, good for the world, and I assumed they were safe. The last 3 years, I've witnessed the good, the bad, and the ugly of wind turbines. This topic is massive. The emotions are high, and distortion and corruption is in play. I will try to present the information I believe people should know. The material is basic and complex, both and obvious and non-intuitive. It's going to take about 50 minutes to get through it as I had originally planned. I will try and make it brief, but it's going to be tough. I would ask that you steadfastly retain human health as your priority. I believe property right considerations are important for regulating noise pollution. If you believe that renewables are the only pathway forward, I would ask you to carefully reconsider. I have no hidden agenda. I dove into this area simply to find the truth, and I am receiving no compensation, which is absolutely fine. I am biased because I simply care about people. So here's just some bullets about wind. You can look at it, it's intermittent, it's unreliable, and expanding toward 100% renewables is frankly absurd if you look at the numbers and how that would happen and with ramifications. And they're a much better and less expensive option we need to pursue at the immediate setting. I want to set the stage here. So a couple events happened in Madison County. The first one is at one of the informational meetings, Mid-America Energy was there and asked, one of the residents asked this developer, we'll call him Matt, if wind turbines were safe. He didn't really respond right away, and he asked him again, I mean, are these going to be safe, and will I be okay? He then looked down, looked up, and said hesitantly, I guess they're safe. Yeah, they're safe. The second event occurred in Madison County. A year later, 3 people in a cornfield next to a turbine blade that apparently had broken off during calm winds from the hub. There was a TV reporter there who asked the farmer, and this, by the way, was on the 5 o'clock news, who owned the land. He said, and who actually would have been combining that corn in a couple of weeks, said, the TV reporter said, are those safe? And he says, well, I'm not sure now. The next person, the pharmacist who had intensively studied wind turbines preparations, said they certainly are not safe and went off from there. Lastly, the public spokesman for Mid-America Energy responded, they are certainly safe. We've had thousands of turbines operating safely in this state for years. We are providing Iowans with clean energy for all who will need it in the future. Some brief background on the EPA and Onac. So Onac, the EPA created the Office of Noise Abatement Control following the Noise Control Act of 1972. Onac engaged in a wide variety of activities to abate noise pollution under the authority of the Noise Control Act and after 1978, the Quiet Communities Act. That latter, among other directives,
Dr. Johnson,
identified sources for noise, for regulation, and promulgated noise emission standards, coordinated federal research and noise abatement, worked with industry and international, state and local regulators to develop consensus standards, disseminated information, educational materials, and sponsored research concerning the effects of noise and the methods by which it can be abated. Later on, I had a conversation with a county supervisor. I had a scheduled appointment. He was there, I was there. And I asked him what made him feel comfortable that wind turbines have been thoroughly evaluated for any adverse health effects. He told me that to have wind energy and Mid-America Energy so confidently extol turbine safety that he just assumed that the EPA or some federal agency must have approved their use and that they were exhaustively studied for any adverse health effects. I then explained that during the era of deregulation in the late 70s and early 80s, and under the leadership of Ronald Reagan, Congress voted to defund the Office of Noise Abatement and Control. He was amazed that there had never been any initial or ongoing federal health safety approval. He just assumed that it happened. It had gone on for decades, and they, being turbines, were everywhere. How could they not be regulated? I told him that the responsibility to evaluate, monitor, and regulate noise had specifically passed from prior federal oversight to state and now mostly local authorities without funding or vital resources, specifically lacking our technical resource and highly trained engineer specialists to understand the science of industrial wind turbine emissions. Gone is the ability to interpret and stay current with the rapid explosion of medical knowledge that provides greater insight about wind turbine emissions and possible adverse health effects. Interestingly, past and current Iowa governors and our current U.S. Senator have all pushed for wind energy And they have never spoken of this absence of unbiased scientific and medical oversight. They are shooting for 100% renewables to power the state. A conversation then with the Mid-American biologist occurred when I learned about these prospective wind turbines. I called again Matt and asked him about the wind turbine effects on the environment. He kept saying, as far as he knew, there were none. I finally referred him to I was referred to their biologist, who was in Council Bluffs. Upon contacting her, she's very nice, answered. I asked her about the biologic studies in the fields on insects, small mammals, birds, flying bats, and the rest. I wanted to know if evaluations of the environment had been done to demonstrate they were safe. She said, we don't do anything except catch bats and mist nets. We buy in permits and kill eagles, and that's really about it. So are they safe? People care about their health safety. That's what they're focused on. Not once during this wind turbine approval process has been any discussion of studies, evaluations, certifying agents, nor any protective federal division has certified the turbines as safe. We must stick to what the definition of safe is, which is protected from or not exposed to danger or risk. And this again reflects health safety. It is free from harm or of risk and secure from threat of danger, harm, or loss. They have never been shown to be free of danger, harm, or risk. And safe really is a designation like respect that has to be earned and then granted. The EPA defines risk in some pretty particular ways that I think reflect a high level of understanding of the situation. It's a risk of chance of harmful effects to human health or to ecologic systems resulting from exposure to an environmental stressor, a stressor being any physical, chemical, or biologic entity that can induce an adverse effect in humans and ecosystems. When an assessor measures risk, a key part of any good risk assessment is a fair and open presentation of all the uncertainties, including data gaps and limitations of models used to estimate exposure and effects. EPA assessors also use health protective assumptions and recognize that risk assessment often is an ongoing process. About that time when Earth Day was in 1970, so I was a junior in high school. At that time we were worried about air pollution, water pollution, and about that time the EPA commissioned a Columbia University Law Review to look at noise pollution, some of the future legal research that would be needed. First line in their report, noise is one of the scourges of the modern world, has become an increasingly dangerous and disturbing environmental pollutant. At the end, a direct cause and effect relationship between excessive noise and death cannot yet be shown. This is 1970. However, the bell that is tolling is a loud one and is getting louder. We now know that environmental noise, such as road traffic noise or air noise, can incite atherosclerotic disease, which can then cause death. They also noted the inadequacies of existing legal remedies and the fact that there can be some time between exposure and the disease presentation. Clearly the most disruptive effect that we need to focus on is, with noise pollution is loss of sleep. And that infrasound is a sound that may damage the body and the mind, even though it cannot be heard. And I think Rick James tomorrow will talk a fair amount about infrasound. The directives given from Congress to the EPA through the Noise Control Act of '72 was to publish scientific information about the kind and extent of all identifiable effects of different qualities and quantities of noise. And also directed to define acceptable levels under various conditions which would protect public health and welfare with an adequate margin of safety. When I think of margin of safety, I think everybody who is exposed all of them are in fact completely safe. That is not what is currently happening. A 1978 summary of federal noise research, I'll skip the second part. They actively sought out a very broad source of research expertise. Not only was that the EPA and all their resources, but the Departments of Defense, Consumer Product Safety, Energy Research and Development, the National Academy of Science, NASA, the National Science Foundation, and many others. They had literally carte blanche choice of any science or any resource they needed with the entire federal government to make the best assessment and promulgate protective regulation. So the current setback is roughly 1,500 feet. It varies from 1,000 feet to perhaps thousands of feet. But this began in the UK in the pre-year 2000 because the existing regulation as a British standard 4142 was based on likelihood of complaints. And as you know, wind turbines can only get quieter if they move them back farther. They had a writing group that wanted to create a guideline that included acousticians, attorneys, contractors, businessmen, and governmental developers, but there was no independent medical expert. They developed the ETSU ARDS 97 as a guideline that it never was approved as regulation. It was described by the world's acoustician experts as developed specifically to circumvent more science-based and health protective UK regulations. There was no medical study or evaluation of the turbine noise nor health safety. When this became implemented, the world became to consider residents living near wind turbines as acceptable collateral damage. It initiated the practice of uncompensated noise trespassing inside rather than at the property line where other pollution regulation and enforcement occurs. I recently got a larger coverage for my umbrella insurance, and I was reading through it, which is unusual. I guess I have more time now. And I came across the word pollutant, and it was defined as electrical or magnetic emissions, electromagnetic particles or fields, whether visible or invisible. Talked about then noise. I read some more, and I said, I wonder what this is. So I finally got through to the insurance underwriter and asked him whether their protracted description of a pollutant included industrial wind turbines. He said, absolutely. When I asked why they didn't just say industrial wind turbines, they said it would take too long to get the state insurance board to permit that wordage. When I asked them, why don't you insure industrial wind turbines? They said because they have not been evaluated as safe and there are lots of risks that remain undefined. So if wind turbines emit pollutants without being designated as safe or without defined risk, why would you permit them to be placed in the state and threaten citizens? It's important that we define health. It includes not just cancer and heart attacks. It's a broad composite of not only physical and mental health, but also represents a positive living condition. It encompasses the whole of the individual, including interactions with the living environment and supporting social structures. Well-being is defined as a state of being comfortable, healthy, or happy. Mental and physical health are inextricably connected, thus highlighting the need that annoyance at any level can contribute to adverse health effects. So this first part was to talk about what would have happened if Onac had survived. I hope you see that as fair. I think it was useful to highlight the due diligence was taken from us that results in the current practice of resident noise pollution exposure without their consent of both known harm and unknown risk connected to wind turbines. It is important to note the EPA oversight of water and air that has led to not only impressive science, but revealed the potential impacts of these pollutants, but also health protective regulation that secures personal rights and a viable and positive living environment that is essential in the modern definition of health. Annoyance is an adverse health effect by definition. The World Health Organization in 2011 declared that high levels of annoyance caused by environmental noise should be considered as an environmental health burden with cost to people and society. There is a concept the wind energy likes to use, which is called the nocebo effect, which is basically to justify their view that negative reactions to the concept of wind turbine, or maybe the view, are based solely and primarily on psychological expectations. This is really the direct argument they have to claim an absence of direct harm. It also reflects wind energy's willingness to allow harm. Leventhal, who was one of the early primary acousticians, said about wind turbines coming from the Kent Breeze wind farm that they would, quote, not cause serious harm to human health or participating resident. It's also described as will not be substantial or not be serious or not be a significant risk. But what is mild? What is moderate? What is insignificant? If you're exposed, you are getting a potential for those people who are receptive of having adverse noise effects. Long paragraph, but it contains all the wonderful concepts that you need to know about sleep. I'd recommend that you would really spend some time on this paragraph. Sleep is a biologic imperative, very active process, and controls vital functions. At the bottom here, the epidemiologic evidence that chronically disturbed or curtailed sleep associated with a negative health outcome mentioned above is overwhelming. There's a study, Michael Smith, who works with Matthias Bosner, which we'll learn about, where he opens his article published just a couple years ago about sleep being disrupted through both unconscious arousals with frank awakening, both disrupting the otherwise healthy and required progressions through sleep slow wave phase 1, 2, and 3, which are all non-REM, and then over into REM and back and forth over the course of the night. He confirmed that via sleep studies, which is a polysomnogram, analysis of the subject exposed to reproduced verified industrial wind turbine noise that was controlled at a noise level of 32 dBA, which the World Health Organization says is basically the threshold of starting to arouse without wakening the consciousness that occurs during sleep. That at that particular noise level, REM sleep was statistically short in the number of people that he studied. In addition, reflecting the value of self-reported response, 14 of the 17 questionnaire responses indicated worse sleep quality and less restorative sleep when compared to quiet control nights. Here's an important emerging concept that's not ever been described before, and I think we'll hopefully hear more about. The response to stressors, and this being noise, includes two pathways. One is the cortical arousal pathway, which uses the brain or the cortex to recognize and interpret and respond to that arousal. The other one is what is the direct pathway, which is considered the autonomic arousal pathway. That pathway is more affected by a irregular noise pattern or highly intermittent noise. Under controlled lab conditions with transportation noise, highly intermittent nocturnal road noise at 45 dBA, it increased the cumulative duration of the autonomic arousals that sleep and were noticed by cortisol levels that rise the following day. On the other hand, you would expect the classical cortical pathway to have also been noted, but there was no change in the sleep study macro structure of the different waves that reflect the movement through these various structures, and the blood pressure is unchanged, and secretions of nocturnal catecholamines and morning cytokine levels, both of which are inflammatory and responsive to stress, were not elevated. So this suggests that nocturnal noise can have an adverse biologic effect without necessarily disrupting sleep by the classical scored sleep studies. I'll be brief here, but infrasound and infrasound low frequency noise was asked about by the resident at this quote community presentation, and he said, "Isn't this a problem?" Because they hadn't mentioned it. The project manager laughed, smiled, and then only responded with, "What you can't hear won't hurt you." And that's the myth that wind energy would like to perpetuate because it is essential for their business plan. Infrasound is produced, which is a low frequency noise, basically between 0.5 up to 200 hertz. It is actually where most of the energy is, and it attenuates, which means it loses the strength of that energy from the time of emissions to the point where it's received at the receptor at about half the rate. So by a half mile, the audible noise is pretty much gone, and all you see here after that is this infrasound low frequency noise. And in that zone is where the amplitude modulation is typically arises. That is the major source for most of the sleep disturbance complaints. Anyway, they downplay that importance because they, again, recognize to adequately limit, they'd have to definitely move out their setbacks from 1,500 feet to probably at least a mile, with actually the considered appropriate distance being 1.25 miles, which is 2 kilometers. Here's a sound power spectrum of the V112 3 megawatt Destro wind turbine. And you can see in the area red, the infrasound zone, which is up to 20 hertz, and then going all the way to 200 hertz, which represents this energy. As you can see, this is not the small inconspicuous part. This is actually the major component of the energy being emitted by this wind turbine. And from there, we have increasing risk as these turbines keep getting bigger and bigger, that the mean level of energy within that zone actually rises about 3 to 5 decibels per megawatt increase of wind turbine rated capacity. Here are two graphs done at different times that show the difference and distinct uniqueness of wind turbine noise. At the top line, you can see the wind turbine noise tracing, and then this occurs as a percent of highly annoyed population. So here, for example, at 55, which is the sound level, you have roughly 30% of the people being highly annoyed with wind turbine noise. you can see that other forms of noise are lesser affecting, such as airport noise, road traffic noise, and railway noise. In fact, at 55 dBA, the wind turbine noise creates 3 times more highly annoyed people than does the road traffic noise. And that continues with more recent data 8 years later by Michaud in the American wind and Canadian wind studies that show the same relevance of railway at the least and wind turbine at the most. But you'll see actually at lower energies, 35, 40, 45 decibel, that this annoyance is actually splayed upward, reflecting probably the additional annoyance which has come from the advent of higher powered turbines. Again, reflecting a constant threat which is really not appreciated nor actually investigated. So is it fair to compare wind turbine and road turbine noise in terms of cardiovascular disease risk, particularly when the wind turbine noise is actually more annoying? I would say not. Or when road traffic noise and cardiovascular disease now are statistically plotted? No, but it does raise a significant concern that wind turbine noise can cause cardiovascular disease, and I hope this continues to be a focus of other researchers across the world. Wolfgang Babisch, who was the EP director for Germany, in a 2011 editorial talked about this organization of risk, and the question no longer was whether noise causes cardiovascular effects. It is rather, what is the magnitude of the effects in terms of the exposure-response relationship, that being the slope, and the onset or possible threshold, which is the intercept of the increase in risk. Here we have it, 8 years later. Tom Menzel, a cardiologist from Mainz University in Germany, he plots this, and the red line reflects the road traffic cardiovascular risk as a increase in relative risk as a function of the sound levels, and this is DEN levels. So roughly from 50 up to 60 dBA, a 10 decibel rise, there was a rise in the risk from basically 0 up to 0.8. So an 8% risk of developing cardiovascular disease related to this noise from traffic noise. And that's now being established for aircraft noise and some other non-traditional risk factors. So bringing that up, the traditional risk factors that cardiologists were trained about years ago: tobacco use, hypertension, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, obesity, and family history, and now recent additions of non-traditional risk factors, including sleeping problems of any sort, substantial life stresses, inflammatory autoimmune disease such as rheumatoid arthritis or inflammatory bowel disease, and now additional non-intuitive risk factors such as high consumption of refined sugars. This is clarified as causing increased cardiovascular risk, PTSD, obstructive sleep apnea, where they suggest 40% of the U.S. population has that, mild depression, and certain small 2.5 micron particle air pollution. And again, environmental noise, road traffic, air traffic, all being associated as a non-traditional risk factor with high rates of ischemic disease due to obstructive atherosclerotic disease. Unfortunately, there's more disease prevalence in the rural areas where they want to put turbines. A 40% higher risk or higher percent prevalence of heart disease among rural residents, as noted in a CDC notification back in 2017. An interesting meta-analysis that's looked for the subclinical presence of cardiovascular disease was a meta-analysis which is briefly combines multiple similar studies, controls the differences between the studies, and generates a larger population that can be assessed at the endpoint for the desired question. They used all these studies, in fact, they were combined 32, that looked at the burden as reflected by imaging, such as CT of the chest, looking for calcification, reflects calcification association with an established plaques inside the arteries, as well as quantitative carotid intimal medial thickness, as well as measures of endothelial. The endothelial is the inside surface of the vessel that actually controls the opening and closing and dilation, signaling it to the smooth muscle below it. And this augmented arterial stiffness, in which non-invasively you can actually look at pressure flow relationships that can be interpreted in terms of stiffness. What they found that with all these sleep disturbance studies, there was an increased risk related to that sleep disturbance. This meaning that subclinical disease must be recognized in the big picture. So just because they aren't dying, we know that they could be developing subclinical disease as exposed to industrial wind turbines. So here we have cartoons of a car as well as a airplane making noise that then stimulates the brain. Now they can actually image the brain with functional MRI imaging that actually highlights the brain, which is actually being used to acquire and to reflect and decide what to do with that acquired noise. And just to be brief here, it does cause sympathetic nervous system activation. That then causes a form of development for atherosclerosis called systemic inflammation, which then develops and causes initiation of atherosclerotic plaque. With a further inflammation, other forces, that plaque gets worse, it gets bigger, and then finally major adverse cardiac events can occur. So the pathways which have been demonstrated for both traditional as well as non-traditional pathway risk factors include the same: systemic inflammation with sympathetic activation, oxidative stress with endothelial dysfunction. Cartoon showing this progression with noise stress reactions. You'll see released cortisols from the autonomic nervous system. It doesn't come from the cortical aspect, floating, and this actually will cause, because you don't get that stress preparation for free, some injury to your inside of the vessels. This irritation starts as a small problem, and then later cells such as monocytes and eventually macrophages see that, they start to clean that up, and as they die, they leave behind more irritant that will further amplify this problem. Plus, there is a development now of looseness or less tight fittings between these adjacent cells that make up the inside lining, and then you start to have migration of atherosclerotic particles in the lower right, showing the plaque buildup, which on the top shows then this has expanded to the point where the cap actually has ruptured, exposing this lipid-rich core, with then fibrinogen converting to fibrin, which then sequesters clot and platelets, and then causes an ischemic event through partial or complete occlusion of the vessel. So this doesn't happen overnight. It takes up to decades to actually form. But this is the process that is the same with traditional factors as we can see with non-traditional factors that we need to be aware of. Now, the autonomic nervous system, you can read all this, but basically it's a control system that acts largely unconsciously to regulate bodily functions such as heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, other features, and through its activation it facilitates or enhances the individual response of the cells and organs to improve that function in the big picture, to improve survival of a species which has been around for only for millions of years, whereas we in this quote tech world have only been there for a couple to 300 years. Just here's the wiring diagram for the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. In the sympathetic, there's a paraspinal ganglia that gives off all these individual innervations. The parasympathetic nervous system more or less comes off as cranial nerve innervations of these organs. The sympathetic responds to fight or flight. The parasympathetic sleep or eat, and they work in essentially opposing actions where one system will activate, the other one will somewhat inhibit. Basically, there's an undulating balance ongoing, or a responsive rheostat that can tweak the system within seconds or as a momentary change, or can become persistently tilted, almost stuck toward one side or the other. That side typically is a sympathetic side, which would and could occur with chronic stressors, noise probably being one of those, as we have seen in these previous models. Heart rate variability is a tool in which the clinician can measure the variations between sequential beats as that rate is being initiated in the sinoatrial node in the right atrium. This is where the heartbeat starts. And there are some subtle variations between adjacent hearts which reflect this ongoing beat by beat, second by second variation in that balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic limbs. So this, if the heart rate variability is reduced, it reflects enhanced sympathetic activity. So a low frequency studies of low frequency being the 31 to 125 hertz exposure produced a greater reduction in heart rate variability reflective of greater sympathetic stress than the higher frequency, say in 500 to 2000 hertz. noise and tended to persist longer. Another study just last year, within the last 6 or 8 months, is very important because I think it came out of Taiwan, that they actually had heart rate variation being actively measured and monitored during brief and close wind turbine exposure. And this raises the concern that there's unrecognized low-frequency noise that may trigger autonomically driven inflammatory cardiovascular disease. This is a major unknown risk for wind turbines causing cardiovascular disease. This concept has been moved now into implantable devices, in fact, for the last 20 years. So under Autonomics, on a stored combined diagnostic, what's going on in the patient, you can actually see updated values of the Autonomic is seen as a heart rate variability. When it comes down, the patient's getting worse. As it comes up, the patient's doing better. There are other clinical features such as fluid in the lung or an amount of pacing in certain areas which can be used to interact to get a complete setting, or at least a fairly complete assessment of how the patient is doing. A new piece of information which is considered by the EPA as revolutionary, they've never seen anything like this, having actually now been approved, is a device like a pacemaker that there's an electrode placed over the baroreceptor in the corner of the neck at the bifurcation of the carotid. You simply just put open the incision, dissect down, expose the adventitia, put this electrode over it. You don't have to go inside the vessel, tunnel it down so it comes onto the right chest, the pockets form, you connect the pocket with the defibrillator, or pardon me, the pacemaker, and stick it in there, and you program it externally, and you can increase or decrease the output to actually affect what you want. Originally, this concept came as for uncontrolled hypertension control, but now has been used for another more serious cardiovascular disease, being a congestive heart failure. So it sees high sympathetic, but by pacing or by stimulating this, the efferent or outflow autonomic signals are less sympathetic than what was coming in, and definitely more parasympathetic. So it increases the parasympathetic phase to reverse a tilted sympathetic dominance. I want to point out, because these slides were given to me only with approval of how I said this, that it's only approved for indication for resistant hypertension and certain forms of advanced heart failure. It is not for adverse health effects from industrial wind turbines. So some of the data that was presented was the sympathetic activity over time. And a baseline at up to 6 months, you can see on the blue line the average values for all the patients studied that comes down. And there's, again, a marked increase over that same interval testing of the parasympathetic activity. And with this, we're seeing patients with lower heart rates, improved heart, both systolic and probably diastolic, which is relaxation phases, vasodilation, drops in blood pressure, which is what we want to see, and effects on the kidneys to unload fluid from circulation. I want to mention this. There's 2 slides in the original testimony that look at this, which are direct quotes from patients through an organized, interactive, qualitative data collection that really reflect, in their words, how they feel about their position of being held captive, so to speak, in their own homes, in their own properties with this unwanted and unconsented exposure. And you can read all of them. They're emotional. They're to the heart of it. These are your constituents at risk. Finally, just to briefly go through this, there is the Sir Austin Bradford Hill Principles of Biologic Plausibility. There are various tenets here. There's actually 9. And in the absence of complete knowledge or absolute proof, which is the situation with turbines, they are not been proven to be safe, that if you have these, causality principles here, which you've looked at, and then connect those principles with what the evidence that support that particular principle, the more that you have, the tighter and more robust that relationship, the more you can basically assume, the word is assume, that a strong relation or a relation exists. This being the best evidence that it exists in the absence of proof. There was a very extensive review of this in a recent paper that can be looked up on the Sir Austin Bradford Hill principles. Finally, do wind turbines cause adverse effect? For annoyance, yes. For sleep disturbance, yes. In fact, it's the most common complaint, and it's clinically undeniable.
For cardiovascular disease, where I spent most of my time, and I think where the risks are the greatest for the most number of people and the impact on society, their communities, and the rest, cardiovascular disease has not been clarified. But again, for the things I mentioned, traffic noise, aircraft noise, rail traffic, autonomic nervous system activation leading to infrasound, low frequency noise, recognized activation, as well as recognition of sleep disturbance and traffic noise and other causes, and the lessons we learned about what the sympathetic nervous system can do and how we can reverse it, seeing the reversal of cardiovascular disease, there is clearly a risk. We just don't know how close we are to a clear understanding, but it is a risk that we must respect. Just a quick one-page thing: industrial wind turbines with audible noise, perceptible noise, visual reaction through direct and indirect fashions can create sleep disturbance and annoyance. By doing that, these decrease quality of life and well-being, which are essential to health. They are why people move out to the country. That's why they have picnics in the backyard. That is why they have their grandkids come out to see them. So annoyance produces these, among other complaints, sleep disturbance. And so sleep disturbance certainly could be a factor causing cardiovascular effects, as well as annoyance directly causing cardiovascular effects through its intrinsic stress. But the annoyance causes depression and stress. They are each individually recognized as non-traditional risk factors and may have an effect, as does traditional risk factors of diabetes and hypertension. So we've got a number of factors here, all playing on the question whether cardiovascular disease is actually occurring, and it certainly needs recognized further evaluation.
Dr. Johnson?
Why is
Dr.
it so
Johnson?
hard to look at these effects? It's because there are far fewer exposed patients or subjects. There's varying degrees of individual noise sensitivity, and it's very difficult to get a quantification of the true exposure, how far they are away, how intermittent this is. I mean, turbines are only, 0.34% capacity, so it isn't happening every day. It isn't happening every night. How much time do they spend there? I mean, there's a lot of variables which make this difficult to understand. Matthias Bosner, again, he was the guy who was the president of the International Commission on Biological Effects of Environmental Noise, who reviewed and helped summarize the data for the October 2018 World Health Report, stressed that none of the wind noise guideline data from the report reportedly found an absence of risk. That means they've never been proven to be safe, which is needed to declare health safety. He finished his 2019 editorial with a quote: "The fact that more studies are needed should not lead us to postpone the urgently needed protection of the population from noise. The knowledge we have acquired so far about environmental noise is sufficient to take preventative action and substantiate them with the respective legal noise regulation." And from the 2017 textbook from Australia with Hansen, Doolan, and Hansen, "It is time to stop debating whether or not a health problem exists. It is well known that wind farm noise does."
Committee, I'm sorry, we're running out of time here, and he obviously can't hear any response. So rather than open to questions, I know we need to get to the floor at 2:30. We'll have another meeting again tomorrow, but thank you for your patience with this, and hope you review. And we are adjourned. Thank you.